Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, October 24th, and where do you want to start? What do you want to talk about today?
Oh, my goodness. Well, um, we can start with Palestine because I was just reading some things on that.
Okay.
I think, yeah, we can see, what I stated earlier continues to be true. In other words, that clearly the Trump administration is really dedicated to maintaining the ceasefire, but maintaining it really on Israel's terms. In other words, like Lebanon, they were a guarantor for that ceasefire, and it has been violated. I think the last I checked, 3,400 times. But it's technically still in place, and we see something similar. I think there have been like over 80 violations so far by the Israelis, and 98 people killed by the Israelis. But there's really no complaints about that. It's just when Israel is looking for an excuse, like after that incident in Rafah, we don't know exactly what happened, but two IDF soldiers were killed. They wanted to seize upon that. Netanyahu did to break the ceasefire and then to relaunch the invasion. That's where Trump and his people put their foot down. They want to they want to keep some sort of semblance of a ceasefire. There's been just a steady flow of high level Trump officials. Vance was just there, and Witkoff is going there and back, and Jared Kushner, and I think they're just constantly reminding the Israelis that, hey, we're serious about this. In particular Netanyahu, because it's Netanyahu and his coalition that are not really happy with the ceasefire. The rest of the country is, they would like it to go on for a while at least. I think there's no question about that. But there's something else that came up. I think it was Jared Kushner himself mentioned it. He said that, well, there's the yellow line, so-called, that the Israelis withdrew to, the IDF withdrew to, and at yellow line is runs pretty much bisects Gaza, and on the Israeli side of the yellow line, there is 58% of the Gazan territory. So they have more than half of already a very small territory, and the Gazans are squeezed into that the remaining 42%. Now, what Jared Kushner says is that we could start the development on the part that Israel controls. And so, in other words, it could actually, that yellow line could become an ethnic cleansing, boundary. Before we're talking about it, seemed clear that actually Netanyahu and his people were trying to drive all the Gazans out of the northern part and to seize that at least, and to actually establish settlements. But we may see, I don't know, it'll be hard, exactly what this development is going to entail. But it would be something, carried out by people like Jared Kushner, who are really extreme Zionists. We'll see. So anyway, it just, the ceasefire is technically holding. There's obviously an effort to keep it holding. There's pressure from not just the Americans, but, like the Persian Gulf states. They're all pushing hard, to keep it together, a semblance of it, to prevent a resumption of, what was happening before, which was the full-scale invasion of Gaza City. But, Netanyahu is not happy with it. He's looking for ways to break out, and he may very well, probably will eventually succeed.
Do you think that Israel could get away with just settling half of Gaza? Won't there be a huge uproar, outcry? I mean, because for the longest time, the past 2 years, we were told the Israeli talking point was always just give up the hostages and this can end right away and it'll all be over. Just give it, and
Yeah,
then, okay, you got all the hostages or have been released, all the bodies returned or what can be returned. And then
yeah,
it's like, no, now we knew it was ethnic cleansing all along. And
yeah.
now they're just going to go to the next step and say, now we'll just take this land. For more than
Well,
half of Gaza.
it could happen. It could happen. Yeah, I mean, I just can't imagine the misery. I mean, Gaza was already a very densely populated place, and so the remaining Gazans are really just crammed into a very tiny sliver of land. I mean, again, it's living conditions there, are going to be very, very unpleasant. I think if they tried it right now, openly, there would be a great outcry. I don't know. Things will happen. There'll be, over time, Trump will lose, won't have be paying the same attention to this that he's paying to it right now. He may not be making that same effort. Right now he works. You see, he seems to have a limited attention span. We saw what happened after the Alaska summit, for example. In any case, it'll be hard. There will be protests. The Persian Gulf states will be upset to some point, or they have to pretend to be upset. But I don't know. I don't see it happening yet, but I could see it happening sometime in the future. Again, those forces that want those settlements they're very powerful within Israel, and especially within Netanyahu's coalition, which is still the ruling coalition. And they were promised, they understood that they were going to get their settlements in Gaza. So there will be a real push to make it happen, and it just may happen on the other side of the yellow line. That's something that Jared Kushner, he didn't, go into detail by what he meant, like carrying forward with, it would be a development plan without Hamas, because Hamas is on, the western side of the line. But again, just look at the people that are in charge. Jared Kushner. My goodness, this is somebody I think, who clearly is a very, very fervent Zionist and a supporter of Israel expansionism, and here he is overseeing this so-called ceasefire.
Yeah, you said that the U.S. really wants the ceasefire to hold, and they're putting some pressure and flexing some muscle,
Right.
and that's one of the reasons why Vance was over there in Israel. I also saw a video clip with Vance where I guess the Knesset voted at some point in time to annex the West Bank, and they asked Vance about that, and he said, "Oh, it's just them being stupid and antagonistic. It's just symbolic." Is this some type of power play that's happening between who's really in charge here? Is it the Knesset, Netanyahu, Israel, or is it the U.S.? Are we having some type of power clash between the two?
Yeah. And again, I would say this is tactical. It's not like there are anti-Zionist forces in the U.S. that are pushing back against, Zionist expansionism. That would be a big mistake to understand it that way. Again, the people there, everybody from Vance and on down, they're all firmly committed Zionists. But there are divisions within Israel, and for the time being, again, the administration has gone against Netanyahu and his coalition. Netanyahu, if he had his way, he would still be invading Gaza City and working to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But there are a lot of people that was in general unpopular. It was unpopular with the IDF, and it showed. The polls showed that the majority of the population were not in favor of that policy. And above all, they wanted to get the hostages home. So Trump did that, and for that reason, he is considered a real hero in Israel. Now, and I think, again, nobody, I don't say nobody, that's obviously a big mistake, but the majority of people don't want to go right back in there. They're tired. The soldiers have been at it, for pretty much 2 years. And that's not what they really signed up for. That's not the Israeli, system. No, I don't think Zionism remains strong. Actually support in general for ethnic cleansing of Gaza remains strong. That's what the polls show. But I think it's a question of timing. It's something like, let's do this. We'll find an excuse some years down the road. So that's really the big division, and that's something that has enabled Trump to move in. Now, I think even Miriam Edelson, his number one donor, she was in favor of bringing the hostages home. Now, I don't know where she fits in like that. I think she probably does lean to Likudnik side. So, that's somebody I think who probably in the long run will be in Netanyahu's camp, now that the hostages have been brought back. Yes, as for that Knesset vote, that was very interesting. That was something that was, I think, actually initiated by the extremists within Netanyahu's coalition. It's not clear that Netanyahu himself wanted that to happen because he knew it would irritate the Americans. And why is that? Because Trump has made a promise to his buddies in the Persian Gulf that he would not annex the West Bank. Now, there are rumors that he made the promise to Miriam Adelson that he would annex the West Bank, but they told him, like, you're not going to do that. And so, we're going to break off, there will be real consequences if you do that. I think it's just because they understand, again, these people, they don't care about the Palestinians, the royal families in the Persian Gulf. But they do understand how unpopular that would be throughout the Arab and Muslim world. So for the time being, that's why you had Vance saying, that, we're against this. I understand this was just a symbolic, it wasn't a big deal, but it was something I think that actually irritated him and the administration, something that was carried out by the extremists in Netanyahu's coalition. And understanding it passed, it shows there is majority support for doing that within Israel now. But here, this is a time, where Trump is actually in a very strange way, it's not, is able to stand up to an Israeli prime minister in a way that past U.S. presidents were not able to. These are not over issues that are really vital to Zionism, but they are tactical, right? It's like, you can't do this now. And I think he's made that clear to him.
So what do you see for the future of the region or in the short term? Do you see that we'll be entering kind of a lull of hostilities? Israel will continue to do what it does, but at a slower clip. So the accusations of genocide, or for the average viewer, they think, oh, I guess it's over now. This is done. And same thing with the West Bank. They'll continue to, seize homes, build settlements. And,
yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of horrible things going on the West Bank. I think, as we've mentioned a few times, if October 7th never happened and the genocide never happened in Gaza, we would be talking about the West Bank. We would have probably been talking about the West Bank the last couple of years, because it's, the ethnic cleansing there, which was always happening, but was kind of going in slow motion. It had been going in slow motion over the course of years and decades, going all the way back to the early 1970s. That it really picked up, it accelerated, and there have been a lot of, there are horrible things happen there every day. Probably if you pay any attention to Twitter or whatever, I'm sure you've seen some of the things. It's just really shocking. But it's constant. It's constant, and it's accelerated. It's heated up. One town that I visited, that little Orthodox Christian town, Taipei, has been subject to many attacks. And just very recently, there was a number of settlers that surrounded it. I think they attacked some buildings and just actually blocked off the town from the rest of the West Bank for a while. And they've cut down, olive trees and all that. They're doing that. It's a kind of an annual ritual to go out and abuse the Palestinians that are harvesting olives and cut down their trees. And, anyway, the horror in the West Bank continues and has actually picked up. And I think we'll see, it's going to be interesting. That's kind of maybe not really the fair word. It's the ceasefire, I think, is going to hold for a while. I don't know, maybe some months. But in the Lebanese sense, as I've said, it's going to be constantly violated on the Israeli side. And then we may see the beginnings of an ethnic cleansing campaign, start to develop on the Israeli-controlled side of the yellow line.
Do you see anything developing on the Iran front?
I don't. Again, I'll stick to my position. I just don't see any evidence of an imminent, conflict there. I think there's always a risk. Again, we have Netanyahu. He's reckless. He's cornered. He may go to Iran as a solution for his problems in Israel, because he is in trouble in Israel. He is. There are a lot of people that hate him there and want to see him in prison. And, he's frustrated, but maybe he's thinking his ticket out of this is Iran. That's a possibility. I just don't see any signs that that's actually going to happen anytime soon. But of course, there could be a surprise attack, something, against something. I don't think that they're ready to do it. They don't have the air defense. I don't think there's any way that they have, replenished those stockpiles. It's just not possible based on what we know about production capabilities. But there's always a chance that he'll just go for broke because he thinks it's his only way out, and that with the assumption that the Americans will rescue him and that they'll be brought into it. But that's that's a very, very risky venture. And it's not clear that even Netanyahu would try that. And again, on the American side, I haven't seen any signs that Trump is retreating from his position, that he completely obliterated the nuclear program, and that's that. If you suggest otherwise, you're out of here. That's what he did with, his national security advisor, or no, I think it was the head of the DIA. Yeah, the head of the DIA. He, I don't think, I would be surprised but I certainly we could always be surprised by what the Israelis do. I'm not expecting it anytime soon.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else we should cover over the Middle East, or we try to move somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that's enough for the Middle East right now.
Okay. Well, I guess we can move over to Ukraine and Russia. I feel like we haven't touched on it much recently. There's been a lot going on. Let's start with the fact that Trump called off this meeting with Putin in Budapest. Why was it called off?
Oh, who? Well, I can only guess, and I think it's Trump. Trump does things impulsively. I think he was he came up with this meeting idea. It sounds like actually the Russians didn't reject the idea, but they hadn't actually entirely agreed with it either. I think their response, as I understand it, is that, yeah, that's a very good idea to have a meeting, but we do have to lay the groundwork, which is generally their approach. But Trump was said, it's going to happen in a couple of weeks. It was so he was very eager to have this meeting. I think he was the one who proposed it, but then he was the one that canceled it. And that's even unusual. That's a quick turnaround for Trump. But we've seen all kinds of 180s, from Trump. I think this is just another one. And I think it's just, he said this impulsively on the phone and then got, onto Truth Social and started truthing or socialing or whatever you want to call it. And but then all these people got to him and said, you can't do that, and because he just really doesn't have a full grasp of what's going on and understands all the arguments. They can start to, make him feel like, this is just impossible what you've done, it's et cetera, et cetera. And the only way, actually, Putin has all the leverage on you now. And then if you go have this meeting and he doesn't give you anything because he won't, they'll say that you're weak and that Putin, had you for lunch and so on and so forth. The only way to get out is to be tough right now, to escalate, to de-escalate. Why don't there's these sanctions that we've been talking about. Let's slap those on now. And sure enough, that's what has happened. He canceled the meeting, and then the sanctions, the ones against Lukoil and what is it, Rosneft?
I thought I wrote it down somewhere.
It's Lukoil is one of them because I remember our hotel was actually
Rosneft and Lukoil.
Rosneft. Like okay, I knew there was an F in there somewhere. Rosneft, right? Yeah.
I think I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah, because I remember our hotel was close to the Lukoil office in Moscow. But anyway, so yeah, that's happened, and these sanctions are significant. I think they will have, they clearly are already having an impact. They will have an impact in the short run, at least. I think maybe in the long run, again, things will return to normal. Trade routes and arrangements and everything will just be recalibrated, reconfigured, and Russia will continue to export oil. But clearly there's going to be some kind of disruption in the short term because immediately oil prices spiked 5% in response. Oil traders said, "Oh, this is going to create problems. This is going to be a cog in the works." And that was, actually this move was something considered by the Biden administration towards the end of his term, but they decided not to do it. And the reason is that it was a fear that it would raise oil prices, and again, they wanted to get Kamala Harris elected, and this is something that could have an impact on the election outcome. So they didn't go with it. But Trump has, and it already is having an impact. We'll see how much of an impact it's going to have. I suspect in the long run it really won't do much, but it clearly is affecting the oil market right now.
Right. I mean, the EU did pass their 19th sanction package, and I think you told me that there's some like over 25,000 sanctions placed on Russia already. But clearly all sanctions aren't created equal. So is this the biggest, most significant sanction that's been placed on Russia? I mean, because we're talking about the U.S. is placing secondary sanctions. They're going after India. It was just a week ago, or not even that, maybe it was on Monday, that I showed you that clip of Trump talking about Modi and saying like, they're not going to, they've told me they're not buying any Russian oil. That's done. That's huge. It's breaking news.
Yeah.
And then Modi had to come out and said, I never even had a phone call with Trump, and India released a statement saying, no, that's not happening. We're still buying this. And now we're here. And it seems like it's almost like, I feel like Trump said that and he got made fun of a lot for that statement. He's like, well, I'm going to make them stop buying Russian oil. I'm going through with these sanctions. I don't know if that's how his mind works, but it is kind of interesting that...
Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah. But it's kind of interesting that, now they are going after India. And so is this the most significant sanction package we've seen? And has this really fundamentally altered the war? Have we like escalated to a new step? Because I felt for the longest time we were teetering on escalation, de-escalation, and now it seems like then it's like Trump was just teetering de-escalation with a talk, and then over to escalation.
Right. The escalate to de-escalate people, clearly won this round, and they won it very quickly. I think there's no question about it. Well, this is not part of a sanctions. Well, the 19th sanctions package.
Yeah, it's two separate things.
Right.
I know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Just to make clear but it is significant again because you're seeing it's having an impact on the oil market. So it does mean something. It means that the people in the oil business who of course understand what's going on better than anybody else because it's their own money at stake. They are betting that it will lead to a disruption, at least a temporary disruption in oil supplies from Russia. So it is significant. A lot of these other, sanctions that are announced just don't seem to have any impact whatsoever. Now, there are reports that came out, I think both from Reuters, that both Chinese, some Chinese companies and Indian refineries have suspended or are reconsidering purchases of Russian oil. And, that may be a huge exaggeration. It might be entirely false. It probably is in the case of China. I mean, China has just shown that right now it just doesn't care. It has been ignoring, actually more than ignoring American sanctions, it's been retaliating. So it would not be in character for them to bend the knee in this case. So I don't think that that's happening. Now, there's a possibility, though, that the Indians may at least reduce their purchases. India is more vulnerable. It is more dependent on the U.S. than China is. It's not nearly as economically powerful. They don't like it, but they just may decide that we have to mollify these crazies in the U.S. to at least to some extent. So there may be a reduction, at least temporarily. Again, they just might work out something where they end up buying it through third parties and mixing it with other oil or whatever. But they'll have to work that out. You can't do that overnight. It may take a couple months.
Right, that's what I was going to say. I mean, it seems like often the workaround with these is that you pass through a middle country and say, oh, it's actually
Yeah.
Indonesian oil or whatever
Right. Well, that's
instead.
what the
And
Europeans are doing. They're actually buying Russian oil from India. They've been
from
doing
India,
that all,
right?
which is also silly, the whole thing. And now, and, and it's another case of the Westerners, the collective West shooting itself in the foot. Because if you actually succeeded in getting like all Russian oil off the market, then you would have a huge spike. It would be a lot more than 5%. I think it's what is it? Russia is the third largest exporter of oil in the world, if I remember correctly. And so you just take that off the world market, there's going to be a huge spike. I don't know exactly what it would be, but there would be a huge spike, and the ones that would, the Europeans above all, because they don't produce any of their own energy really, would be the main victims of that. But the U.S. would too, even though we're actually I believe we are actually the number one producer of crude oil in the world. We still import it because our consumption exceeds our production. And so, those changes in the international market have a big impact here in the U.S.
Yeah. So, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this? There'll be some short term pain as these countries kind of figure out how to work around these new sanctions? It sounds like a lot of
Yeah.
bureaucratic headache for a lot of countries.
Yeah.
But will the end result be just higher gas energy prices worldwide, but maybe more elevated in Europe? Because I saw something that the majority of the exports end up in Europe anyways. And I think I saw a pie chart on how accurate it was, like 56% of like LNG was going to Europe and like 30 something percent to China, and then the rest elsewhere. So basically what my gathering was that this disruption will hurt Europe more than anybody.
Right.
Is that true? And
Probably. Again, I think they're more vulnerable than just about any other region of the world to these to fluctuations in the international oil market. Now, what's probably, but even more grim, alarming, you should say, in the case of Europe, is their own sanctions package. Not these sanctions applied by the U.S., because that includes an actual entire cutoff. They set a deadline for
LNG
for ending all gas imports from Russia, and I believe it's actually starting no new contracts starting at the beginning of next year. But then I believe it's in 2028 that regardless of whether or not you had a contract, let's say if you have a contract now and let's say it ends in 2027, you're allowed to stick with your contract. But then if it goes beyond 2028, you're going to have to actually terminate the contract at the beginning of 2028. And it's just going to be, that's the end of it, not another molecule of gas, no more LNG. And that's quite serious. That's, again, they are in trouble. We know the kind of trouble like that Germany is in. And that's just in general, I think, like gas prices in Great Britain, of course, not part of the EU, but have quadrupled or something since the beginning of the war. And, people are really struggling to pay their heating bills. It's, it varies from country to country, but in general, not Israel rather, but Europe has suffered and will suffer even more over time, especially if when this most recent sanctions package kicks in. And
right. I just saw that Mercedes-Benz is laying off 30,000 people in Germany. I mean, that's significant. This is just another sign of just deindustrialization.
Right. Well, you get that kind of news, it seems like, at least every other week. They're another, well-known corporation, one of these powerhouses that have always been, kind of like peaks in the economic landscape. Everybody is known about these really world-beating corporations. Yeah, they're suffering. They're suffering huge losses. They're laying off people. In some cases, you're relocating operations to other parts of the world, which tells you, again, there's a problem in Europe specifically. And I think it's not just the energy. Sometimes we get, because we're in geopolitics, we focus on that entirely. There are problems to begin with. But I think if it is the decision to cut themselves off from cheap Russian energy was really the straw that broke the camel's back in there. There was excessive regulation. There were other problems. But this is something that is really doing in the industry. It's just more than the industry can bear at this point.
Now, with this idea to have a complete ban from Russian LNG, do they have a plan, an alternative in place that can be a comparable alternative? There isn't one, right?
There really isn't. They've been importing LNG from the U.S., but it costs 4 times as much as Russian LNG.
So it sounds like, is the plan to go back to like using candles? Do they have a plan?
Yeah, well, the Greens think they can do it just with windmills and solar panels. You might be able to do it with the solar panels in Morocco, but not in Germany.
Yeah, not in Germany. I was about to say. Yeah,
they just can't.
Place.
It's going to lead to deindustrialization. I guess you could. No matter what, let's say maybe some of these companies will survive, they'll learn to adapt. Maybe the Germans will make other adjustments, to improve the business environment, let's say, within Germany. But they will be, it's a permanent handicap, just put it that way. Again, there's no benefit in paying 2, 3, 4 times as much for your energy, when you have a large industrial plant. It's only, an increased cost. There's only a downside to it. And maybe some of these companies can survive, but they're always going to be at a disadvantage because of it.
It's really hard to understand the decision making
it is
within Europe. It's just
totally irrational.
Can we talk a little bit about the Nexperia incident? So do you know much about that?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it. Of course, we're talking Nexperia. That was a Chinese company in the Netherlands. Yeah. That is a subsidiary, of the Nexperia, back in China, and it was essentially seized by the Dutch authorities at the request of the Americans. That's what that news came out later, and they fired the CEO, a Chinese, and I don't know who the replacement is, but they have declared for national security reasons that this company is essentially under their control. Now, the Chinese, again, they don't play around. What they did is they immediately, first of all, informed their employees, the employees of Nexperia in the Netherlands, that you do not need to obey the orders of the new management. That you're because you are a subsidiary of this Chinese company, and it's this is where the authority is. And then they said, as long as this is the Dutch government maintains control of Nexperia in the Netherlands, we're not sending them chips from China, because it turns out that most of the chips that are produced back in China. And now this has caused alarm in other parts of Europe, because these chips apparently, are essential to the production of certain goods, cars, automobiles, for example, in Germany. So there was some report that came out, I think, in the German publication Bild, that said that the production lines and German auto manufacturers were going to have shut down in, soon, like next week, or some of them would, and others maybe next month. Now, I think, what was it, Mercedes-Benz, or was it I can't remember which, or maybe it was Volkswagen. I can't remember. We're talking about a major German auto manufacturer. The manufacturer was contacted, and they said, "Oh, that's not really true," but there's essentially applied, well, there is something to it. So we don't know exactly. Maybe Bild was overstating the problem, but there's clearly a problem.
Yeah, it's just it's one of those things that just makes me wonder how could this decision be made? Yeah. Because when you seize Nexperia, I mean, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, because they create semiconductor chips. That's what Nexperia does. I was like, well, okay, clearly they want to secure. The reason is they want to secure that semiconductor chip making process. But the chips aren't even made there. And Nexperia is just like they seize like the headquarters. They just seize like a bunch of people in suits, managers and things like that. I guess there's R&D and stuff there, but the chips themselves, they're being made in China. So it's like, I just don't understand. If you're going to seize anything, you should be seizing the manufacturing process, right? I mean, I just don't understand.
Right.
Was there an idea that they could do it? And even though all the chips are made there, it's like, well, we're not going to give you the chips. You stole our company.
Right. Just a total lack of foresight. Yeah, again.
But it's almost beyond, like, how could that not be seen? I don't understand.
No. It's shocking. It's just shockingly, primitive or, just stupid. How could they do that? But they did it, and they did it because the Americans told them. And then that just takes us back to the complete vassalage of the European states. This shocking, this really, I find it to be a really shameful, embarrassing relationship that they have to the U.S. But the leadership throughout Europe has, they have simply declared themselves to be vassals. And it's just when the Americans tell them to do something, it's, they just salute and do it. That's what happened in the Netherlands.
So do they just like call up the Dutch government and just tell them, and they say, yes, sir? Is it? I mean,
it sure seems to be that way. Yeah, I mean, really.
Is it because they see themselves as part of just this? They don't see them so much themselves as Dutch. It's part of this globalist mentality. It's like
I think it must be right. I mean, if you had a system, I think it has to be. I think that's probably part of it. Is there's been kind of a dilution of identity throughout Europe, and maybe that's a consequence of the EU. And now the EU has worked to dilute, these separate national identities, but it hasn't replaced it with anything. Like nobody's really feels is going to go and die for Ursula and Brussels. That's just a great bureaucracy, and so you have these people in charge that are kind of gray bureaucrats in the end. They're administrators for this globalist enterprise. I think that's right, and they understand that they see the U.S. as the head. Okay, we have Brussels, but above the headquarters is really back in Washington, and Washington issued the order, and we got to do it.
Surely there's got to be a lot of anger bubbling up now within Europe. Is that anger being directed mostly towards the leaders, or do people understand that, it's because DC is telling them? I mean, Europe is just like our whipping boy. We just do this, man, and you take the punishment, and
right. Well, again, there are those populist parties, I think especially the AfD, that does express that anger or gives voice to that anger. And there's also, National Rally in France, which to a lesser extent does the same thing. But again, they're outside. They don't have any, they haven't been able to penetrate the corridors of power. They're kept outside, through, various means that we've discussed earlier. So in general, these people, I think that they don't, the anger is out there, but they don't experience it. They're protected from it.
Yeah, I think the elites, they can justify everything because they have a greater battle to fight, and that's the battle against Russia. And so that can justify sacrificing anything, because when you're going up against what in their mind is this existential threat, the reincarnation of Hitler or whatever, then, it's okay to sacrifice your whole economy and everything else. But, I'd like to go back to the Ukraine war a little bit, but now... Have we entered, do you think, like a new phase? It seems like the European leaders, despite losing Nexperia, their economy and deindustrializing, they seem to be happy because they got Trump to flip over to the escalation side, right?
Right.
Are we fundamentally at a different stage of the war? Because the idea of any type of semblance of, getting a negotiated peace settlement or Trump de-escalating just seems to be out the window now. So are we... I mean, what do you see? Are we marching ourselves to a direct war? Are we marching? What's happening?
Well,
tomahawks again.
Right.
I mean,
I guess what you'd have to say that we're back on the escalation ladder that Biden put us on. There throughout, the nearly 3 years of the war when he was president, there was a steady escalation, and then there was a pause. We have to say when Trump took office, and it looks like that has come to an end. And, we have these sanctions that Biden himself didn't even dare to impose. And, well, it's unclear what's going on with the long-range missiles. It's just, there have been reports of some HIMARS strike. I'm not really sure that maybe the HIMARS is something that the Ukrainians can do on their own. Now, I know others have said that, no, it has to be approved by the U.S., but I'm just not sure. There was an article in the New York Times like 2 or 3 years ago that said that each HIMARS target had to be approved by it. Now, I have my doubts about that because I know it hasn't happened so much recently, but going back 2 years ago or so, there were many, many strikes with HIMARS on purely civilian targets, marketplaces, and that kind of things, even double tap strikes with HIMARS. And, maybe I'm naive, but I have trouble believing that the Americans actually approved that. I hope, maybe I just don't want to, accept the ugly reality, but I don't think they would. So I'm kind of doubtful about HIMARS, whether or not, that may be purely Ukrainian. But then more recently, there was a report of these, I believe they were they were Storm Shadow missiles that are said to have struck. The Ukrainians announced that they had struck a chemical plant in the Bryansk region, I believe. And the Russians haven't said anything about it. We haven't seen any satellite photos, so that's not confirmed. But if indeed that happened, that would be a return to these, missile strikes. Let's say, we'll just call them NATO-involved or NATO-operated missile strikes into pre-2014 Russia. And that would be, I think the first clear, if that indeed happened, it would show that we were back to where we were at the end of Biden's term. And we are on an escalatory path. Even though Trump seems to have pulled back from the Tomahawk abyss, there are these other missiles. There's still the Storm Shadows and the Attackams and the Scalps and potentially Taurus. And all of those do require NATO involvement or more than involvement. I think NATO has to program them. This is my understanding, for these missiles to hit their targets. And so they would be direct attacks by NATO on Russia. Now, for a while there, Putin was when he was confronted with this, there's all this talk about the Tomahawks. He refused to, issue a stern warning, as he had actually back in 2024 concerning like attack on strikes. He said this is clearly, this would be a NATO attack and we would have to respond. And we did get that Oreshnik response, right? But he wouldn't do it. And that led to a lot of frustration in Russia. But now I think it was just yesterday, he actually said that there would be a serious response, if not a staggering one, or sometimes it's translated overwhelming. Is speaking about long-range missile strikes. So we are, it looks like we're going back to where we were. It's a very dangerous situation, and yeah.
Well, I think the reason it feels a little bit different now is that I think Putin has fundamentally changed his view. I think up until just a couple of days ago, I think Putin was thinking, okay, I can work with Trump, just keep on talking to him, engage in flattery. But I think at this point, he just realized like it's a lost cause. No more of this Mr. Nice Guy game with Trump. I'll be cordial, but now it's time to be firm, adopt more of the Chinese approach to dealing with the United States. Do you think that's where we are?
I think probably we are. It's too early, but this comment from Putin, I think, does indicate a real change of direction. I think, again, that may have been like what led up to his phone call with Trump. He knew there was a real problem, but he felt like he had to address Trump directly and hopefully work it out with him. And then, I guess now that he's seen this whole thing fall apart and the new sanctions imposed, they said, yeah, it's become clear that that's just basically a waste of time, and that we just have to, we have to take more of the Chinese approach anyway. Yeah, I don't think they're going to go all that far, but we do have to make the deterrence clear. One thing that needs to be noted is that even though there have been these diplomatic efforts by Putin, there was never a slowdown on the front. So it wasn't like he was had actually abandoned the military effort. He never. There was no evidence of any sort of constraint, or any sort of slowdown again by the Russians on that side, and I think now that's only going to continue and possibly intensify. I think it certainly will. There are interesting rumors. It still hasn't been confirmed, but the rumors have been quite persistent that there was some sort of landing on the right bank of the Dnieper River, which is to say the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper River in the Kherson region.
I heard that
again,
well, yeah.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I saw one report, then I saw another, and you just think, well, who knows, but you keep on hearing about it, and it sounds like something's going on. It's just not clear. It may be that these are more scouts, or what do they call them, the sabotage units, that they're there, that there's no attempt so far to create a permanent beachhead, but we don't know. The Russians aren't saying anything about it. It's just all rumor, and we haven't received any visual confirmation yet.
Okay. Well, it does sound like we're in a scarier stage in the war. At least the optics of it, to me, it's now Trump and Putin are kind of enemies now. They're establishing that line. Before, it was just kind of like this pretense. Oh, even though we were directly involved, Trump was playing this role of friendly mediator, and Putin was humoring that role. And now it seems like that's over. So does it feel like we are, just at the most dangerous stage of this war since it started?
Well, I think we're probably back to where we were like at the end of last year under Biden. I think we're back to, yeah. Especially if it turns out, again, it hasn't been confirmed, but if it turns out that storm shadows were used, to strike this chemical plant, we'll have to find out. If that's the case, then we're back to where we were. Again, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that the Trump administration had lifted the restrictions, I guess, that they had imposed when they took office, the restrictions on the missiles into pre-2014 Russia. And if that, Trump denied it, but then the Wall Street Journal, actually standing by their story, and then we have this report of an attack on a chemical plant, and tells us that we're back to where we were again at the end of the Biden administration. And maybe it's even a little scarier just because the Europeans have just gone so nutty. They're the anti-Russian hysteria, the war hysteria, the talk of, the kind of a war fever, a strange kind of fever, a very diluted fever. They're not really ramping up production in any significant way, but this is the talk. It's 90% rhetorical. But rhetoric has an impact. You constantly talk about war. Eventually, you may very well have a war. It is worrying.
Do they want war? Do they really want war with Russia?
It almost sounds like it. Again, it's madness. To actually want war with Russia. I think there's no question of that. It's just madness. It really means World War III, or makes World War III very likely. And even if you thought you could win this war, well, you can't, because if you could actually, threaten the existence of Russia, then we're just put right there at the edge of the nuclear abyss. It's complete madness. But these people just don't seem to have a very good grip on reality. Have very little grip on reality.
I'm trying to search for a question, but it's always just like, why are
Why?
they
I
behaving
know.
this? You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
try to rationalize the thinking. I mean, I guess what goes through my mind is like, the politicians are all underwater, and they feel like maybe the only way out is a war. But it seems just. I mean, you just think like the way out would just be say, hey, let's not have a war. That's a popular decision to make, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I just don't understand. Is there any appetite amongst the general population for war, or is this really just concentrated
No.
amongst the political elite?
Right. Well, we even saw those polls recently in Germany that the majority of Germans, even if their country was invaded, would not fight for it. And I think, which just it doesn't surprise me. These are the people who had their own, energy infrastructure blown up, and they just haven't done anything. The vast majority, or certainly a majority of Germans, just seem to be totally apathetic, and you get that feeling throughout much of Europe. So you have apathetic people, and you have these just hysterical leaders. It's a very strange situation.
Yeah, I
It just
guess.
can't end well for Europe. We talk about like the complete, the irrationality of Trump and his constant reversals and his these often very self-destructive policies that he's pursuing, especially vis-a-vis China. But the Europeans play along with it. Again, we saw what happened in the Netherlands. You were just hoping like there would be some sort of reservoir of wisdom in Europe. Maybe we saw that back, in the early 2000s in the run up to the Iraq War. The French said no, they put their foot down, right? And they were right. But we just don't have that anymore. There just seems to be that independence, and that tradition of statesmanship is just gone. And we have these bureaucrats and wannabe Churchills, running around, just spouting nonsense. And you wonder what's going on. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess the strange thing for me is that it's gone on for so long. I
Right.
felt like at some point that there would be some type of democratic process that would replace it, and you would get to reflect the will of the majority, right? I mean, but we know that the democracy is so it's democracy in quotation marks. It seems like you're only if it's part of the system it gets promoted and can make it to the top, but it just feels like the will of the people is these leaders aren't reflecting it, but it does seem like in general the European people, I don't think they know what to think either. I think a lot of them just are afraid of Russia. They are afraid, but they don't know where to turn. They're upset with their current leadership. Doesn't seem like an alternative. What do you see for the future? I see a way out.
Yeah, well, again, there are these opposition parties, and like the AfD really has consistently advocated a different approach to Russia. And it's not so clear actually in the case of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. They have made a lot of compromises and softened their stance, and even more so in the case of Nigel Farage. He looks like he and his Reform Party are poised to win in the UK. And he had made some comments earlier about, the necessity of reducing tensions with Russia, and he came under a lot of attack for that. But recently he's gone out and, uttered the same kind of nonsense that Keir Starmer does about Russia. And so I don't think we have any reason to hope there. There's not a lot. We had that election in Czechoslovakia, well, not Czechoslovakia, I'm still living in the past, the Czech Republic, that did bring somebody to power who was at least significantly less anti-Russian. We do have the holdout states of Slovakia and Hungary, but they're under a lot of pressure, and they're very small states within the European Union. It doesn't really look very hopeful right now, unfortunately. There doesn't seem to be enough of an awakening and understanding. I think in general, it's just like the European public is so misinformed. They're not, they probably believe by and large what they're told by their leaders. They don't share the same, they don't have the same passionate attachment to Ukraine. And many of them are just kind of sick of Ukrainians within their own country, but they believe more or less what they're told about the Ukraine war. And say, oh yeah, it's a real problem. But if they're asked, do you want to go fight? The answer is no. And I think it's going to stay that way. So, maybe the only thing that we have to really hope in is the apathy of the, the Europeans. It's just that they have these hysterical leaders, but they don't really have the foot soldiers. And in the end, the Russians will call their bluff.
They don't have anything. They don't have the foot soldiers. They don't have weapons. They don't have the economy. They don't have it. I mean, the idea is that they can, the Baltic countries are the perfect example of the ones that bark the loudest. But the idea is, of course, to have America do it. And I think Americans are so sick of this being the thing. Israel, go fight our wars. Ukraine, go fight our war. It's like, don't wait. We're on the other side of the world. This is just insanity. This is the problem with empire, is that we are telling Europeans what to do, and they supplicate themselves. But they're doing that because they know that they can get something from us, and that is hopefully our intervention in their war. Which
I think they're probably mistaken. You never can be completely sure about Trump.
I shouldn't say their war. It's our war, I know as well.
Right. Yeah, to a great extent. It really is. We're the ones who pushed them into it. There was resistance, when we first proposed NATO membership for Ukraine. There was resistance from among the Europeans, but they caved in, and now, it's just like you would never know that they actually resisted it. They're the most zealous advocates of it.
Or that the Ukrainians resisted it. When they did a vote in 2008, only 20% of Ukrainians voted to be part of NATO. And we said, that's not okay, time for a coup.
That's what, that's what polls showed back then. That's not, and they're right up through, 2014 and the coup, there was a majority against NATO membership. But, that doesn't matter what the people think.
Democracy.
Yeah. Well, it shows kind of the general weakness of Western hegemony. There's first of all, declining Western strength relative to the rest of the world. And the relative rise of the BRICS countries. We've talked about that. We talked about that a lot last time. But, you're pointing to another aspect of it. It's just that, even within the West, there's no longer the appetite for hegemony among the people. Don't send us out there to maintain your empire. It's like, we'll wave our, our number one foam fingers or whatever. I think they love that. And they're happy when Trump blows up a speedboat, unfortunately, or whatever. But don't think about sending my son overseas. Don't even think about that. And I really don't want to pay an extra $50 billion or $100 billion or whatever for this war that you're talking about. Now they've gotten away with it. We've talked about the fiat money system, the printing press. They've been able to do these wars, I think, in large part in the U.S. because the cost of it is disguised. We just print money instead of sending a bill to the taxpayers. But that's becoming increasingly difficult to do, as the dollar begins to decline. So, there are these forces. It's not just the relative strengths of American-led Western hegemony vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but also there's a weakening within. And again, that's, I think, a reason to be hopeful in a way. It's just, it's a dangerous situation because these people at the top are just clearly deluded, and they still have a lot of powerful weapons, including nuclear weapons. But they're, the ground that they're standing on is just increasingly shaky.
Yeah. I just saw that we are now over 38 trillion in debt, right? We added that last trillion. I saw somewhere it was like 70 days to add that next
70,
trillion.
75 days, something like that. Yeah. It's an extraordinary rate. It's accelerating.
Right. So shouldn't this be the bigger problem that will bring everything down? I mean, this is a trillion in 70
it's
days.
Amazing. It happened and there was virtually no comment on it. It's just like this is a problem. This should be the number one problem. You're right. And instead you get people talking about, sending more money to Ukraine or whatever, it's.
And there's no chance of reform, right? Are we just all sitting around waiting for a collapse? Is there any way that it's not some type of collapse? And I'm at the point where I'm just hoping for the collapse, because then it could end the empire and the terrifying prospect of a direct war with Russia, World War III, or a war with Iran, or even Venezuela, whatever it is. Just let's end this madness. It just seems like we've gone completely insane. We're on this rampage, but we're so sick. The debt that we have is just dragging us down. Our health bar is at zero, but we're still just swinging around and just waiting for it to fall down. Just let's take a rest. I'm always talking, and I just feel like I feel like it should be happening any minute. I'm always just looking around.
Well, it always could, but like I've said, that sometimes these things can drag on. The U.S. still has strengths. It has we've talked about the weaknesses of the military, but there are strengths, and we do have. Tomahawk missiles may be a weapon from the 80s, but we have at least 4,500 of them, and they can do real damage.
Anyway,
it's just
relative to China or Russia.
Yeah. No. It's clearly everything is actually the whole playing field is tilting away from us, and we're not recognizing it. And there doesn't seem to be, whether we're talking about economics, again, the three pillars, in all cases, those pillars are weakening, and we don't see virtually no signs, only really at the edges, the Thomas Masseys, the few, and increasing number of Democrats that are taking on Zionism, and then also the smaller number of Republicans. But in general, they're just, that's still out there on the edges. Now, that may change. And we'll see what happens in the congressional elections. Will there be a real shift, or will AIPAC and the rest of them still win, still manage to maintain their firm grip? Or is that grip starting to slip? It looks like it is in the case of AIPAC. We've recently had some Democrats, some actually well-established Democrats, return the money that returned AIPAC money, saying, I don't want this money. I think that's huge. That's a sign of an impending earthquake. So there are things happening, unfortunately just not enough. But like you say, maybe the biggest thing of all is the economic crisis that will eventually hit us, this economic storm. And there's just no willingness, it seems like, on either side of the aisle to deal with that. It's just because it's so huge, everybody knows that like any solution or is going to be so painful that whoever proposes the solution is going to be immediately voted out of office. The problem has become so severe. It's like this tumor is metastasized to such a huge point that you're going to have to just cut out a huge amount of flesh, and nobody wants to do that. So we just look the other way, but eventually the crisis will come, and maybe that's, again, a crisis, an opportunity for real solutions finally to be proposed and accepted. Everybody understands at that point. It's easy when, like right now, things are, getting worse, but we're still okay. And you're talking about this crisis. I don't really see it. We're still number one. But then, okay, there's a real collapse, let's say an economic collapse. Then, those people like Thomas Massey or whatever, they actually have an audience. People who didn't want to hear about it, they understand, yes, something radical must be done. They're open to radical solutions. The danger is that we don't have enough people with sensible solutions, and we have crazies, like it seems like and idiots, and so many of our leaders seem to be some combination of insane and stupid, and we just may end up with solutions that make the problem even worse. So, but maybe, it will weaken us to the extent that we can't do so much harm around the world. That's one, I guess that's something you're hoping. But then there's always a chance, as we see again, it's just like when there are an internal crisis, often politicians, go into full demagogic mode and start to point to external enemies. And so the war, the risk of war can actually increase under those circumstances.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll see. By the way, is the government still shut down?
Yeah.
This is crazy. We're adding $1 trillion to our debt. The government's not even open.
No. It shows just an increasing, dysfunctionality. It seemed to have a dysfunctional government, and there doesn't seem to be any move to actually bring this to an end. This This has
Yeah.
gone on for a couple of weeks already, and
Yeah, it's
there's
pretty
no.
long. I'm wondering, we'll get to a point where if it's just been shut down for like several months, and people are like, "Well, why reopen it?" Like,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well,
we'll
people
see what
will miss
happens.
certain services, no question about it. But yeah, there are probably other services that people are realizing that they can do without. Well, the thing is, there's always some group, that benefits from these programs, and well, anyway, this is a
Yeah,
long theoretical discussion that we don't need to get into.
yeah. There's a lot. The things we'll do to not release the Epstein files. We'll see. Until the government shut down forever. Okay. All right, Dad. We'll end it there. Have a good
All right.
rest of your day and
You
a
too.
great weekend. Okay.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Bye bye.